Beneath the soft hush of a well-tended English garden, where roses bloom in orderly silence and secrets settle like dew on morning petals, something long buried begins to stir. Not every departure is a vanishing, and not every object forgotten is truly lost. In the quiet lanes of St. Mary Mead, time moves slowly, but memory lingers, whispering its truths when the world grows still enough to listen. Where in the world are you tuning in from today, and what time is it there? Let me know in the comments. Now then, let us walk the garden path with Miss Marple and listen. The final note of the village pianist's recital drifted into silence like a feather settling on old brocade. There was a soft spattering of applause, polite rather than effusive, as was appropriate for a Wednesday afternoon charity event. The hall at St. Mary Mead was comfortably full of familiar faces, lightly dusted with talcum powder and powdered blush, their expressions serene with the satisfaction of having done their bit for the church roof fund. Marmalade sponge was passed on silver trays, its orange tang cutting pleasantly through the dullness of the performance. The vicar's wife made efficient rounds with small china cups, and old Mr. Smeaton attempted, once again, to recall a Chopin prelude he had once heard in Bath, without success. Miss Marple, seated near the edge of the third row, smiled faintly at nothing in particular, her eyes drifting from the bowed heads and chatting neighbours to the far end of the room, where the cloakroom door stood ajar. The recital concluded with a mild flurry of goodbyes, genteel coats retrieved, gloves fitted, and umbrellas tapped to check for dampness. No one rushed, and yet there was a quiet urgency among them all, the kind bred from the English habit of tea at precisely 4 o'clock. The room slowly emptied, its warmth lingering. In the hush that followed, the vicar's curate closed the cloakroom door. It was he who first remarked upon the oddity. 5 hats remained hanging on their brass pegs, though only 4 had been accounted for in the last of the departing guests. One of the hats, a woman's, neatly trimmed with faded blue velvet, hung at a peculiar angle, as though set down in haste. No one could recall seeing it worn. No one, in fact, could recall a woman to match it. No feathers, no navy coat, no scent of lavender left in its wake. The other 4 hats belonged to regulars and were swiftly claimed in the usual absent-minded bustle. But the 5th remained, a silent sentinel in the corner, its velvet slightly worn, and its presence unspoken as the caretaker turned the lights out. No comment was made, but for 1 or 2 who noticed, there remained a faint, inexplicable feeling that something had not aligned quite as it should. Colonel Bertram Winthrop was not often seen at village functions. A recent returnee to St. Mary Mead, he had retired with some quiet fanfare and promptly retreated into a solitary life at Honeysuckle Lodge, a cottage he had inherited from an uncle on his mother's side. Most knew him as a stiff, meticulously groomed figure glimpsed through hedge gaps or standing at the post box at precisely 8:15 each morning. It was therefore something of a surprise when, the next morning, word trickled through that the colonel had been found dead in his back garden, near the archway where roses were just beginning to bud. His housekeeper, arriving late due to a missed bus, had found him slumped by the stone bench, his hand clutching the damp grass, his expression oddly frozen in surprise. The local doctor declared it a fall, neck broken by poor footing on mossy stones, an unfortunate but not unnatural event. And yet, as the police made their quiet inquiries, a few villagers exchanged looks over jam jars and sugar scoops, unsure how such a careful man could misjudge his own garden path. Behind lace curtains, behind the newspaper counter, and under polite queries, the murmur began. At Danesfield Cottage, the morning sun touched the rim of Miss Marple's teacup as she stirred in a modest measure of milk. Cherry, her companion and housemaid, had just returned from the greengrocer and came bearing more than apples. "They say he was found just past 8, she said, laying the brown paper bundle on the table. "Fallen in the garden, poor man. But I heard Mrs. Clark at the baker's say there was a gash on his temple." Miss Marple looked up from her embroidery. "Did she now? And was Mrs. Clark there?" "Well, no," Cherry admitted. "But it's gone about already. You know how these things travel." "Like candle wax on a saucer," Miss Marple murmured, threading her needle. "Spreads wide, but very thin." Cherry poured the tea, and the conversation turned to garden peas and the cost of currants. But the Colonel's name lingered like a scent in a room long after the windows had been closed. The blue sky that morning was patchy, clouds drifting like old handkerchiefs in wind. From her place near the parlour window, Miss Marple sat with a basket of darning in her lap and a cat curled at her feet. Her fingers moved gently, but her mind wandered, not over the Colonel himself, whom she had barely met, but over the cloakroom. It was Cherry who had mentioned it quite innocently. 5 hats, she had said, and only 4 ladies gone through the door. "Odd, that," she had said, with a light laugh. "Perhaps someone came without a coat and changed their mind." But Miss Marple had been at the recital. She had watched the audience as she always did, observing the little expressions, the turned heads, the elbows nudging at unseasonal remarks, and she could not place a 5th hat among them. She saw no woman who wore blue velvet that afternoon, no scent of powder that lingered too long, no conversation that suggested she had even been present. A forgotten hat, perhaps. But Miss Marple had seen many such forgettings in her time. They were rarely accidents, and never truly without consequence. She laid the darning aside and reached for her diary, making a quiet note beside that day's date. The vicarage drawing-room, with its faint scent of beeswax and old roses, was host to an afternoon tea of gentle ceremony. Miss Marple sat with her back to the French windows, the soft clink of porcelain accompanied by the occasional chirp of sparrows from the garden beyond. Mrs. Weatherby, the vicar's wife, presided with kindly precision, pouring tea into cups that had belonged to her grandmother, while Miss Marple accepted her plate with a wordless nod of thanks. The talk began, as it often did, with remarks on the weather and the unfortunate lack of rain for the lilacs, but it soon turned, as it always would, to the matter of Colonel Winthrop. The vicar's wife had not known him well, a military man, naturally reserved, but she had noticed, as had others, that he rarely joined in village activities. And yet, she added with a thoughtful wrinkle of her brow, he had begun to come round these past weeks. Just last Sunday he stayed longer than usual after the service. Quite nearly sociable. Miss Marple, stirring her tea slowly, said nothing at first. But when Mrs. Weatherby mentioned the doctor's opinion, a simple fall, likely quite immediate, she set down her spoon and looked quietly out of the window. "I have always thought," she said at last, "that the things which seem most immediate are often the result of something long in the making." The tea was poured, the sponge cake passed again, but the room felt fractionally less tranquil. It was Miss Crampton who introduced the notion, later that day, as she lingered by the post-box with a handful of envelopes. Her tone was light, but her brows were delicately arched with implication. "There was talk, you know, of someone visiting the Colonel. A lady from up north, tall, with a fur collar. No one knew her." Miss Marple, who happened to be posting a letter to her niece, offered no reply beyond a faint, inquiring tilt of the head. "Oh, I dare say it's nothing," Miss Crampton continued, "but Edith Long saw her near the Colonel's gate last week, and Edith's eyesight may be poor, but she never forgets a silhouette. Besides, the Colonel was quite, restless of late." Miss Marple murmured a soft sound of agreement, but her eyes, alert behind her gentle expression, were already sifting the rumour for its weight. A woman from the north might mean nothing, or it might mean quite a lot, especially if she had been unaccounted for in official recollections. She returned home with her knitting under one arm, and a question she did not speak aloud. Why had the colonel, so private for so long, begun entertaining unknown visitors in the final days of his life? The parish council minutes, neatly typed and pinned to the notice board, seemed innocuous to most. But behind the pews and hymnals, among those who followed local politics with quiet fervour, the colonel's recent vote had caused a small storm. He had, without warning, altered his stance on the proposed sale of the glebe land, once staunchly opposed, now conspicuously in favour. At the grocer's, Miss Marple overheard Mr. Hargrove, who always carried the minutes in his head, remark to the butcher's wife, "It was rather a jolt, him changing sides like that. Never gave a reason. Just said he'd reconsidered." "It wasn't like him," murmured the butcher's wife. "Not at all." Miss Marple accepted her quarter-pound of ginger biscuits and said nothing. But she remembered the old colonel from years before, his spine straight as a fencing post, his sense of duty immovable. A man like that did not simply change his mind without considerable cause. Something had shifted then, something internal, and it had left the village uneasy, though most did not know why. She stepped into the sunlight, her parcel tucked under her arm, and considered that political reversals, like unclaimed hats, often meant more than they first appeared to. The scent of warm bread and raspberry tart was heavy in the air as Miss Marple stepped into the bakery. Behind the counter, Miss Hartnell, never one to whisper when she could imply, was already deep in conversation with Mrs. Linley. "Writing things down, he was," she said, tapping the countertop for emphasis. "Had a little book, I heard. Notes. Some say it was a memoir, but others—" She leaned forward, lowering her voice only slightly. "Others say it might have been more of a list." "A list of what?" asked Mrs. Linley, eyes wide. "Names," said Miss Hartnell, in a tone meant to echo. "People who had wronged him, or perhaps wronged others. Wartime matters, land deals, nothing to put in print if you ask me." Miss Marple, selecting a modest currant bun, gave the appearance of distracted interest. But her thoughts were sharp as she handed over the coin. It was not uncommon, she knew, for men of a certain age, especially those with military service and private grievances, to write down truths they could not say aloud. Whether for posterity or revenge was another matter entirely. If Colonel Winthrop had begun such a document, and someone had known of it, that knowledge might have proven more dangerous than any weapon. In conversation at the vicarage garden, the talk returned to the recital. It was Miss Lavinia Clegg, pinched, observant, who raised the matter of the hat. "There was a fifth, wasn't there?" she said, refilling her cup. "A blue one, with a velvet band. I remember thinking it didn't quite suit the rest. No one seemed to claim it." The others nodded, vaguely recalling the same. "Left behind, perhaps," said the vicar's wife. "Or brought by someone who never arrived." "But that's just it," Miss Marple murmured, her voice gently woven into the breeze. "Someone must have come. Hats don't appear on pegs by themselves." The words stirred unease, like a ripple in a still pond. No one had seen the hat worn. No one had seen it taken. It had simply been there, and then, quietly, not. And if someone had slipped in unseen, they could just as easily have slipped out again, unnoticed, unrecorded, and perhaps quite deliberate in their disappearance. Over the following days, opinions about the colonel's death divided along invisible lines. Among the upper pews of St. Mary Mead, it was deemed an unfortunate accident. Among the lower stalls, it was something else entirely. At the post office, young Mrs. Cripps remarked, "Well, he weren't one for mixing, was he? Always kept his nose high. Folks like that collect enemies and don't know it." Whereas Mrs. Bellew, whose husband had served under the colonel, said quite firmly, "He was a gentleman, and we don't speak ill of the dead." Miss Marple, in the corner with her parcels, listened to both. She had always believed that truth lived in the gap between perceptions. It was not what people said, but how they said it, whose grief was reflex and whose anger wore the veil of respectability. Later that evening, she sat by her fireplace, her hands still over a skein of grey wool, and thought how very little separates a solitary man from a suspicious one, depending entirely, of course, on who is doing the looking. Lucinda Carver arrived in St. Mary Mead just after the morning post, her presence as discreet as the carriage clock ticking in the vicar's hallway. The taxi that carried her from the station turned back without delay, its wheels barely leaving a print on the lane. She walked up the path to Honeysuckle Lodge with a composure that was not cold but carefully preserved, like something wrapped in linen and put away for safekeeping. Miss Marple observed her from the lane, trimming a particularly stubborn rosebush. She saw a tall woman, plainly dressed but not unfashionably so, with a bearing that belonged more to London libraries than village greens. There was no hesitation in Lucinda's step, nor expectation of welcome in her eyes. The neighbours noted her, of course. Mrs. Pettingill, who passed her near the church gate, described her as a lady who wears her grief as though it were a duty. Others remembered her vaguely, tall, rather striking, a girl once seen with an officer's posture and foreign mannerisms. Lucinda did not pause at the vicarage nor at the grocer's. She went straight to her late father's cottage and used the key that had been sent by post. She turned it as one might turn the page of a long unread letter, with both caution and resolve. Lucinda's reappearance sparked no scandal, only subdued curiosity. Her name was spoken softly in shops and between hedges, not unkindly, but always with a lingering ellipsis. "She married that German fellow, didn't she?" said Miss Clegg over the post office scales. "During the war, some kind of artist." "Translator, I believe," replied Mrs. Bellew, "and quite the gentleman from what I recall. But the Colonel, well, he never forgave her, did he?" Few had known Lucinda well before she left. Fewer still had seen her since. She had, in village parlance, gone off, first to London, then to Yorkshire. Her wartime marriage, though legal, had been the subject of lowered voices. Respectable folk did not object to forgiveness, but they preferred it happen quietly, behind the curtain. Now, as a widow, she had returned without ceremony, her mourning dress modest, her manner unyielding. No tears, no fuss. Just the business of death, papers to sign, items to sort, keys to return. Yet Miss Marple, seated at her embroidery, noted that Lucinda had not requested a cleaning service, nor made arrangements to leave quickly. That sort of silence usually meant something remained unresolved. The invitation was phrased as an ordinary kindness. "Do come for a cup of tea if the sorting becomes too heavy," and accepted with a brief, sincere nod. Lucinda arrived precisely on time, her gloves folded carefully and her expression unreadable, like a page that refused to reveal its headline. Miss Marple received her with gentle deference, asking no questions beyond whether she preferred lemon or milk. They sat in the drawing-room, where light filtered softly through lace curtains and the mantelpiece clock marked time without haste. "I remember you when you were quite a girl," Miss Marple said at last, placing a plate of seed cake within reach. "You had a rather determined way of walking even then." Lucinda smiled faintly. "I suppose I always felt the need to move forward." There was no bitterness in her voice, only a tired precision. She stirred her tea without drinking, and Miss Marple noted how carefully she avoided looking at the piano in the corner, an older model, long out of tune. "Your father," Miss Marple said gently, "was much admired, though not always understood." Lucinda gave a nod, not of agreement, but of reluctant recognition. That was always the case. The silence between them was not awkward. It was contemplative, and Miss Marple, with a flicker of intuitive clarity, knew they had begun. Lucinda set her cup down with the quiet decisiveness of someone long accustomed to managing emotion. Her fingers hovered over the rim, then withdrew. "My husband died 2 winters ago," she said. "Influenza. There was very little warning." Miss Marple gave a soft murmur of sympathy, not the sort that intrudes, but the kind that makes space for truth. "We lived quite simply," Lucinda continued. "He taught languages. I painted when I could. My father never approved of the arrangement, or of him." There was no bitterness, only a well-worn cadence to her voice, a line rehearsed and repeated over time until it sounded almost weightless. Miss Marple folded her hands in her lap. "It is very hard, I think, when time goes on without ever resolving a hurt. One doesn't notice the damage, not directly, but it accumulates." Lucinda nodded once. "I never thought to come back. But he wrote to me. Just one letter. 2 weeks before his death." "And in it?" Miss Marple prompted. "He said he hoped I would forgive him for not understanding," Lucinda replied, "and that he wished I would return, if only for a while." It was not, Miss Marple thought, a confession, but it was something close. After tea, Lucinda had returned to the cottage alone. The house, though modest, bore the hallmarks of order without warmth. Brass polished, books aligned, but no evidence of life's softer traces. She stood for some time in the sitting-room, uncertain whether to sit. It was as though the air inside resisted her, each corner silently asking whether she truly belonged. And then she saw it. On the mantelpiece stood a plain oak frame. It held no photograph, only a pale rectangle of paper with one torn corner and a faint mark where adhesive had once been. The frame itself had been dusted, but not recently. There was a slight impression in the layer of fine powder where something had been touched, then taken. Lucinda picked it up, inspecting the back. The nails had been pried up gently, not in haste. Whatever had been removed had been done so deliberately. She did not cry, but her lips pressed together for a moment, and her hand did not immediately return the frame to its place. Outside, a bird called once, and then fell silent. Lucinda moved from room to room with the manner of someone relearning a language she once spoke fluently. The house was clean, even neat, but there was no softness to it, no books with creased spines, no slippers left near the hearth, just the cold precision of duty. In her childhood room, the wallpaper was unchanged, yellow roses on a faded cream. A small bookshelf still held the poetry she had once read aloud, now gathering a fine veil of dust. A trunk in the corner held linen folded with military accuracy. In the kitchen, she found 2 mugs, one chipped, the other new. A gesture, perhaps, toward a reconciliation that never happened. She paused by the window, looking out onto the garden path where her father had fallen. The hedges were trimmed, the rose arch tidy. But something in the symmetry felt unnatural, too controlled, as though mistakes had not been allowed to take root here. And yet, they had. Quietly, under the surface. The silence of the house was not peaceful. It was watchful, unsettled. Lucinda stood very still, and in that stillness, something shifted in her expression. A flicker of loss, yes, but also something deeper, something waiting. Miss Marple, dressed in her neatest grey tweed, stepped into the solicitor's office with the delicate air of someone who rarely imposed but always noticed everything. Mr. Harrington, who had handled the small affairs of most of St. Mary Mead for 2 decades, rose with brisk civility, assuming she had come on behalf of an ailing acquaintance or a charitable bequest. "I do hope I'm not troubling you," Miss Marple said with gentle formality, seating herself with practiced grace. "It's about poor Mrs. Fanshawe. She was quite concerned about her niece's papers, and with Colonel Winthrop's passing, I thought I might inquire. Her eyes did not waver from his as he nodded, reassured by the familiar ambiguity of her request. But it was not Mrs. Fanshaw's niece that interested Miss Marple. It was the mention she had overheard at the fishmonger's, that the Colonel had made a new will. Mr. Harrington, loosening his tone now that he had established the visit was of the usual kind, confided that, yes, Colonel Winthrop had indeed altered his will just a fortnight ago. The new beneficiary was none other than Miss Lucinda Carver, reinstated after more than a decade of estrangement. The Colonel had made the appointment himself early in the morning, with no hint of hesitation. Miss Marple left shortly afterward with the same gentle smile, but as she passed the lilac hedge, her thoughts turned quietly inward. It was not the change of will that unsettled her, it was the timing. The Colonel's new will, signed precisely 2 days before his death, had raised no legal objections, but within the village its implications stirred polite unease. Some found it admirable, a late reconciliation, perhaps prompted by illness or reflection. Others found it oddly convenient. At the dress shop, Mrs. Hartnell murmured over thimbles and threads, "Well, if she's to inherit, she ought to show herself a bit more. Can't just sweep in and take everything with a grim expression." "I dare say she wasn't expecting anything," Miss Marple replied, thumbing a bolt of muslin. "Estrangement makes one careful with hopes." Still, her own thoughts lingered on the document. A new will was often the beginning of an ending, not the end itself. It was an act of resolution, one that required clarity, but not necessarily peace. She had seen too many such reversals, some generous, some guilt-driven, and a few very carefully engineered. Lucinda, for her part, had said nothing of the will. That silence itself was curious. And so, with that quiet doubt folded between her errands, Miss Marple returned home, pondering not whether Lucinda had been rightful heir, but whether someone else might have wanted her not to be. That same evening, as she paused to admire the begonias outside the churchyard wall, Miss Marple encountered Miss Blodgett, a retiree with arthritic knees and an appetite for quiet observation. "Oh, Miss Marple," she said, adjusting her scarf against the breeze, "I've meant to mention it. I saw someone outside Colonel Winthrop's garden the other week. After dusk it was, maybe 9 o'clock. Tall fellow, rather quick on his feet." "Was he coming or going?" Miss Marple asked lightly. "Going, I think, down the back lane. Had a dark coat and one of those hats, soft-brimmed. Didn't look like a local man." "And the Colonel? Was he at home?" "Oh, yes. His light was on. I remember, because I thought it odd he should have visitors so late. He was never much one for company." Miss Marple thanked her gently and continued on, but her thoughts were sharper than before. A visitor at night, not a neighbour, not known, the sort of call that preferred darkness to courtesy, and perhaps, just perhaps, the sort of visitor whose presence was not meant to be mentioned. The next morning, Miss Marple took the early train to Basingstoke under the guise of visiting a cousin's niece. In truth, her destination was a modest boarding house on a quiet side street, one that she recalled had once advertised rooms for gentlemen of discretion. With the landlady's cooperation, gently prompted by Miss Marple's remarks about her late brother's time in service, she obtained a name. Mr. Anthony Markham, lodger, ex-army, occupation unstated. The name stirred something faint in her memory, and it was confirmed when she browsed the local records at the reading room. Markham had served with the Colonel in the same regiment during the war. Their paths had crossed in France, and once more during a tribunal hearing in 46. She requested no further details. What she required, more than facts, was understanding. That evening She wrote a polite note requesting a brief visit, and by the following afternoon she was seated opposite Mr. Markham in a room that smelled faintly of old books and disinfectant. He was courteous, guarded, and not in the least surprised to hear Colonel Winthrop's name. "You're not the first to come asking about him," he said quietly. Miss Marple inclined her head. "Oh? And what were they hoping to find?" He smiled without mirth. "Perhaps the same thing you are. A reason." Anthony Markham was not a dramatic man, nor did he invite pity. His words were measured, his gaze unflinching. But beneath the coolness, Miss Marple sensed an old wound, kept clean, but never quite healed. "Your colonel," he said, after a long pause, "was a brilliant strategist, precise, never uncertain." "And yet," Miss Marple said gently, "something troubled him." Markham nodded. "In the war, there was an incident. Orders were given, strict ones. I questioned them. Quietly, but I did. He had me transferred. Black mark on my record. Career ended not with disgrace, but with silence, which is almost worse." Miss Marple sipped her tea, her hands perfectly still. "He wrote to me once, years later. Asked forgiveness. I replied. He never answered. Then a month ago I received another letter. Said he was compiling a record, a personal one. Things left unsaid." "You went to see him?" "Yes, at night. He agreed to meet, but he hadn't expected me to bring anything. I gave him some documents. Old, but relevant." Miss Marple waited. "I never heard from him again." And with that, she saw it. Not a blackmailer, but a man who had held on to truth as a defence, then handed it over in trust, only to be left once more in silence. Miss Marple returned to St. Mary Mead under a sky veiled with cloud. The wind had turned, and with it came the scent of wood smoke, autumn beginning to gather its breath. As she walked the familiar path home, her thoughts sorted themselves, not with haste, but with care. She had known men like Colonel Winthrop all her life, men of iron will and fragile pride, capable of remorse, yes, but always on their own terms. War had shaped him, as it had shaped others, but not always in visible ways. Miss Marple had seen the toll it took in quiet corners of the village, in sudden silences, broken engagements, sons never spoken of again. And now a man had come bearing memories the colonel had tried to bury, a change of will, a request for reconciliation, a document, perhaps, too dangerous to be allowed its full light. What Miss Marple saw most clearly, however, was not guilt alone, but the pattern of it, the kind of guilt that settled like dust, undisturbed until someone tried to clean the shelf. She made no pronouncements, no judgments, but she did pick up her notebook when she returned, and on the next page she wrote 2 lines. "Forgiveness delayed is not forgiveness denied, but it may come too late to prevent damage." The village hall smelled faintly of old floor polish and daffodils. Chairs had been arranged with deliberate neatness, and the vicar presided not as a spiritual figure, but as the social anchor that such occasions demanded. The solicitor, Mr. Harrington, unfolded the will with a clearing of his throat, his manner brisk but respectful. Lucinda sat near the front, her hands folded in her lap, her expression unreadable. There were no dramatic gasps. The document merely confirmed what had already been whispered. Colonel Winthrop had left everything to his daughter. His estate, modest though it was, had passed intact to the woman long absent from the village. Miss Marple sat quietly near the window, observing not Lucinda, but those around her, the sideways glances, the tightening of lips, the way Mrs. Pargeter's hand hovered just a moment too long over her handbag clasp. It was only after the reading had concluded, and guests began dispersing into hushed groups near the tea urn, that the murmur of fresh news reached them. There had been a break-in at the Colonel's cottage. "Nothing much taken," the constable said when asked. But the sitting room was disturbed, papers shifted, drawers open, and a frame empty. Miss Marple turned back to her tea without a word. An inheritance formalized, a house entered, and a picture removed. In such things, she thought, the motive is not always value, but memory. Lucinda returned to the cottage with a growing weight she could not quite place. The formality of the will had done little to settle anything in her spirit. If anything, it had deepened her sense of unease. The house was just as she'd left it, or nearly so. At first, the changes were subtle. A chair not quite aligned, a curtain drawn too tightly. But it was the mantelpiece that struck her. The small oak frame, once empty, now stood precisely where it had before. But its backing had been pressed down anew, and when she touched the corners, the faint residue of adhesive clung to her fingertips. The photograph, the one of her mother, young and unsmiling, was gone, taken with precision, not torn out in haste, but removed with care. Lucinda sat down slowly, her hand still curled near her lap. It was not the loss of the image itself that unsettled her, but the suggestion behind its absence. Someone else had wanted it, needed it. She looked about the room as though the walls might explain themselves, but they remained silent, their floral wallpaper neither warmer nor colder than before. Later that afternoon, the vicarage became the unexpected stage for another small disappearance. The blue velvet hat, the one no one had seen worn, yet everyone had spoken of, had been stored quietly in a cupboard just off the cloakroom. Out of sight, but not out of mind. It was Mrs. Weatherby who discovered its absence. "I went to fetch the linen table runner," she said, "and it was simply gone. The box was still there, but the hat vanished." No windows had been disturbed, no doors left open. The cupboard had been unlocked, but it had always been unlocked. "I dare say it's been misplaced," said the vicar, but his tone lacked conviction. Miss Marple, who had arrived with a parcel of lemon sponge, did not comment until later. Over tea, she remarked, quite softly, "It's curious how things disappear when no one is looking, not with haste, but with decision." Mrs. Weatherby nodded, troubled. "It's not a valuable hat, surely?" "No," Miss Marple agreed, "but value is so rarely the reason things are taken. Sometimes it's what they remind us of that matters." She took a small bite of sponge and thought about hats left behind, hats that had never been worn except by someone not meant to be seen. News spread the next morning, not by announcement, but by the rhythm of feet hurrying where they normally lingered. Young Martin, the groundskeeper at the old rectory, had been seen leaving Colonel Winthrop's garden shed in the early dawn, a canvas satchel over one shoulder and an expression described variously as troubled and vacant. The constable had acted swiftly. Martin had not resisted. Inside the bag were several items of no particular value, a small leather notebook, a pair of gardening gloves, and a folded handkerchief. But the act of taking anything at all was enough to warrant suspicion. Lucinda was informed by note. The villagers, however, discussed it openly. "He was always quiet, that one," muttered Miss Hartnell. "Too quiet, if you ask me." Mrs. Bellew took a sterner tone. "Always lurking about. I never liked the look of him." Miss Marple said nothing, but took particular interest in the fact that none of the supposed stolen items matched the missing photograph, nor the hat, nor, for that matter, the letter the Colonel was said to have written before his death. Martin's face, when she saw him later at the station, was not one of guilt, but confusion, and when he caught her eye, he looked not fearful, but oddly relieved, as though being suspected had saved him from something worse. In the days that followed, Suspicion rippled through St. Mary Mead like wind across wheat. It moved with grace, but bent everything in its path. Martin, now held in quiet custody, became the central topic of conversation in every kitchen and grocer's queue. "He was always hanging about the sheds," said Mrs. Linton, too fond of privacy. "They say he once climbed the roof of the schoolhouse," added another, "just to watch the pigeons." Each statement, innocent on the surface, carried an undercurrent of judgment. Miss Marple, hearing them all in passing, thought how effortlessly a village could create a narrative, particularly when it suited a need for resolution. Martin had no family to speak for him, no patrons, no alibi the village would trust. And yet, Miss Marple recalled something rather more telling. He had always been gentle with the flowers in the churchyard, always replaced tools exactly as he'd found them. She began to suspect that his greatest crime, in the eyes of the village, was not what he had done, but what he had failed to be. Not respectable, not from here, not someone they'd ever invited to tea. And so the village, with the softest of voices, had turned accusation into certainty. It was on a walk to the greengrocer's that Miss Marple saw it. Martin, led briefly through the churchyard under constable escort, stepping carefully along the gravel path. His gait, at that moment, bore a slight limp. The same limp had been described at the reading of the will, when he'd been spotted behind the colonel's shed. Yet, a week earlier, Miss Marple had seen him lifting a crate of planting soil with both knees strong, his stride even as a plumb line. Now, watching him closely, she noted something strange. The limp appeared only when he thought himself observed. She did not mention it. Not to the constable, not to Cherry, not even to the vicar's wife, who would have listened with full attention. Instead, she filed it quietly among the other details. The vanished hat, the missing photograph, the colonel's changed will, and the shadowy visitor seen at dusk. In her experience, truth seldom revealed itself in declarations. It arrived through small things, how one stood, what one remembered, or in this case, how one walked, or pretended to. The village library, a modest building with ivy-softened walls and narrow shelves that held more memory than fiction, offered the perfect kind of quiet, the sort that listened. Miss Marple entered shortly after 10, greeted the clerk with a kindly nod, and made her way to the back alcove where the parish council records were stored in tidy boxes marked by year. She was in no particular hurry. Her fingers turned the pages gently, one by one, until she found what she sought. The minutes from a meeting held just 6 weeks prior. Colonel Winthrop, long an opponent of the parish land sale, had unexpectedly voted in favour. The note was terse, revised position 4, but its impact echoed loudly in hindsight. Miss Marple read it twice, then closed the folder and sat still for a long moment. The colonel had not offered explanation, and none had been asked. Such reversals were rare in a man of his temperament. She looked out of the small window that framed the green, and thought of how changes in opinion often came not from belief, but from pressure, or in some cases, guilt. Outside, the bells of St. Clement's chimed the half-hour. Miss Marple rose slowly, her thoughts already beginning to shape themselves, not into certainty, but into something far more valuable: suspicion rooted in context. The blue velvet hat had remained in Miss Marple's mind, like a half-remembered tune. It was not only its presence that had disturbed her, but the detail no one else had remarked upon. The small feather tucked into its band, dyed a shade of indigo one rarely encountered in practical attire. After some quiet inquiry through her niece's friend in London, who had once apprenticed with a theatrical costumier, Miss Marple received word confirming her instinct. That particular feather dye, an iridescent blend of violet and black, had not been commercially available for nearly 20 years. It had been used by a costume supplier serving small theatres and amateur dramatic societies, particularly during the post-war years. The implication, like a gentle footfall behind a curtain, was not lost on her. A woman of a certain generation, with theatrical leanings, would have kept such an item not for fashion, but for memory. It was not a hat one wore into the village. It was a hat one had worn once, on stage or in performance, and could never quite part with. Miss Marple folded the note and placed it inside her diary, where it nestled against a pressed flower and a penciled proverb. Things worn in vanity often return in disguise. In the quiet corners of her mind, Miss Marple began to trace a delicate silhouette, someone with a taste for drama, once admired, now nearly forgotten. It did not take long for the outline to gather a name: Mrs. Clarissa Pargeter. Once known for her roles in the village's amateur theatrical society, particularly a well-remembered turn as Lady Macbeth in 1948, Mrs. Pargeter had slowly retreated from public view after the death of her husband, a respected organist. She had no children, no brothers, and little family beyond a distant cousin in Eastbourne. Her world had narrowed to her garden, the library, and the occasional appearance at jumble sales. Miss Marple recalled the way Clarissa had once laughed, grandly, as though from a stage, and the way she had gradually fallen silent in recent years. That sort of withdrawal was rarely a simple matter of age. It was often loss, or more often still, something unresolved. And it was Mrs. Pargeter, Miss Marple now remembered, who had once appeared at the same recital hall 30 years ago, wearing, of all things, a blue velvet hat trimmed with feather. No one else had thought of it. But Miss Marple had never been in the habit of forgetting costumes. Miss Marple called on Mrs. Pargeter the following afternoon, bearing a jar of quince jelly and a smile of innocent intent. She was received with grace, if not enthusiasm. The sitting-room was dimly lit, and Mrs. Pargeter's manner was cordial but cautious, like an actress unsure of the role she was now expected to play. They spoke first of gardens, then of church flowers, then of the recital. Mrs. Pargeter demurred. She had not attended, she said, not in the mood for Chopin or sponge cake. Her voice had retained its former precision, though its timbre had lost its warmth. "You've not been out much of late," Miss Marple observed mildly. "One finds company less rewarding than one used to," Mrs. Pargeter replied, lifting her teacup with a tremor so slight it could have been imagined. "I dare say," Miss Marple said gently. "The past is often less taxing than the present." Mrs. Pargeter did not reply, but her eyes, for the briefest moment, shifted toward the corner cabinet, where a porcelain figurine now stood alone, out of place on a shelf that had once held something larger. They parted politely. But as Miss Marple stepped through the front gate, she could not help but feel that her hostess had been waiting, not for company, but for the right moment to be found out. It had not escaped Miss Marple's notice that the cupboard in Mrs. Pargeter's sitting-room bore the faint impression of an object recently removed. The dust, though otherwise undisturbed, revealed the outline of a box, rectangular, perhaps leather-bound, and once resting on 4 small brass studs. A hat box, quite possibly, the sort one might keep not for use but for sentiment, and now gone. Miss Marple mentioned nothing of it, not even when Cherry asked about her visit, but she reflected on how certain people, when left alone long enough, preserve relics of themselves in hidden corners, like forgotten rolls in a drawer. And if such a relic were brought into the light again, worn once more for a purpose not theatrical but personal, then it might suggest motive, or at the very least, presence. She made a note to call at the vicarage again, to ask, quite casually, who had last handled the remaining cloakroom keys, and to check, if possible, whether any new hats had been seen in the charity bins since the recital. Because hats may hide faces, but they rarely hide motives, not in a village and
certainly not from...
Someone who has lived long enough to know what women do with memories too difficult to speak of. Later that evening, with the wind rustling faintly through the hedge and the cat asleep by the hearth, Miss Marple sat in quiet reflection. Her knitting remained untouched on her lap. Her eyes, half closed, saw not wool or tea leaves, but memories of fates past and faces observed from behind trestle tables. It was never the woman at the centre of the crowd who posed a mystery. It was always the one who lingered in the wings, offering help but not opinions. The one who stayed behind to clear away ribbons and gather forgotten gloves. The one who noticed everything but spoke little. Mrs. Pargeter had once been adored for her presence. Now she was nearly invisible, except to those who knew where old grievances waited, folded into drawers like theatre scripts left too long unread. Miss Marple's thoughts formed not a conclusion, but a shape. A woman scorned, not out of vanity, but out of loneliness. A life once almost shared with Colonel Winthrop, a will not altered as expected, a reconciliation not extended, and a hat once theatrical, now repurposed for a darker scene. Miss Marple sighed, folded her knitting, and quietly marked the date in her diary. The next step would not be to confront, but to gather. And then, with everyone assembled, the truth, quiet, sorrowful, and long rehearsed, would take the stage. The drawing-room at the vicarage was modestly furnished, with no attempt at grandeur. A soft breeze passed through the open window, fluttering the corner of the lace tablecloth. Miss Marple sat comfortably in the armchair near the fireplace, her knitting basket beside her but untouched. Mrs. Weatherby had prepared a tea tray, now resting on the low table, though no one reached for it. Instead, there was a stillness in the room, not of discomfort, but of something being waited upon. Lucinda Carver sat upright, her gloves in her lap. Martin, the young groundskeeper, shifted uneasily on the edge of his chair, while Mrs. Pargeter maintained an expression of composed disinterest. Mr. Harrington, the solicitor, leaned slightly forward, hands folded, curious. "I thought it only right," Miss Marple began gently, "that we clarify a few small matters, matters which, when placed together, form quite a significant pattern." No one spoke. "Sometimes," she continued, "a village recital is not merely an afternoon's entertainment, but the beginning of a quiet performance none of us anticipated." Her voice remained mild, but her gaze missed nothing. Behind her words, there was already knowledge, offered not as accusation, but as invitation, and so the scene was set, not for conflict, but for the slow, certain uncovering of truth. "It began," Miss Marple said, "with a hat, or rather, with the presence of a hat where none should have been." She turned to Mrs. Pargeter, whose posture had become very still. "A blue velvet hat, trimmed with an iridescent feather, distinctive, the sort one remembers, particularly when it was never seen worn by any of the ladies present that day." Lucinda looked puzzled. Martin frowned. "The cloakroom was carefully observed," Miss Marple continued. 5 hats remained at the end of the recital, yet only 4 women were seen to leave with theirs. The 5th, the velvet one, was never worn inside. Mr. Harrington stirred. "Then how did it come to be there?" "Planted," Miss Marple replied gently. "Left not in forgetfulness, but to suggest presence without identity. A red herring, one might say." She glanced again at Mrs. Pargeter. "It was placed by someone who wished to appear to have been absent, and yet had very much been there." A pause. Mrs. Pargeter said nothing. "But," Miss Marple said softly, "as with all performances, something was overlooked. The feathers dye, a unique blend, had once been used in amateur theatre costuming,
and there are very few in our village who once played Lady Macbeth in a blue feathered hat." Mrs. Pargeter's expression did not falter, but a subtle heaviness crept into her features, as though some inner curtain had dropped at last. Miss Marple's tone softened. "There was a time, I believe, when you and Colonel Winthrop were well regarded. After your husband passed, some assumed there might be an understanding." Mrs. Pargeter said quietly, "People see what they want to see." "But you had reason to hope," Miss Marple said gently. "He visited often enough, accepted your invitations, shared stories." Still no denial came. "But then," Miss Marple continued, "he changed, grew distant, and—"
When his daughter returned, when he reconciled with her, you understood that the place you had imagined was no longer being offered. Mrs. Pargeter's voice was barely audible. "He never said so." "No," Miss Marple replied, "but silence in such matters can speak rather loudly." There was no bitterness in her tone, only an old woman's understanding of loneliness, disappointment, and the fragile pride that sometimes follows both. What few knew, Miss Marple went on, was that the Colonel had written to Lucinda before his death, a letter of reconciliation, a request that she return, and he had already altered his will, naming her his heir. Lucinda nodded slowly. "He wrote that he had been wrong, about my marriage, about everything." "The will," said Mr. Harrington, "was filed 2 days before his passing. Quite legal, quite clear." Miss Marple looked toward Mrs. Pargeter. "And I dare say it came as a surprise." Mrs. Pargeter did not answer, but her hands gripped the edges of her chair as though holding something steady. "I believe," Miss Marple said, "you had long expected that the Colonel's affairs would pass to you, not from greed, but from a sense of quiet certainty, an understanding, perhaps never spoken aloud." There was no shame in her voice, only sadness. "And when you learned of Lucinda's return," Miss Marple continued, "you understood what it meant, that whatever future you had imagined for yourself was no longer there." The room remained silent, but something in the air had shifted. A truth once unspoken had now found its voice. "It was not planned," Miss Marple said, "not premeditated, but it was not, I think, an accident either." She folded her hands calmly. "You went to the cottage that evening, didn't you? After the recital, wearing the hat. You had changed into it there, quickly, quietly, and you left it in the cloakroom, knowing it would confuse the count of attendees." Mrs. Pargeter did not speak. "You confronted him in the garden. The conversation turned bitter. He told you, I believe, that Lucinda had already inherited everything, that his letter to you had not been sent, not because he hadn't written it, but because he had chosen not to post it." Her voice was softer now, with an almost maternal gentleness. "It was dark. You were angry. You said something. So did he. And then, in that moment—" She did not finish the sentence. There was no need. Mrs. Pargeter closed her eyes. "I only meant to make him listen," she whispered. "He was walking away. Always walking away." Lucinda's eyes glistened, but she remained silent. "It was pride," Mrs. Pargeter said. "Not rage. I wanted to be seen." Miss Marple offered no judgment. She simply said, "And he saw you, but far too late." The room had grown quieter, not from shock, but from something deeper, a collective recognition of sorrow too old for outrage. Miss Marple turned to Lucinda. "You never once spoke of the will, or the estate." Lucinda gave a faint shake of her head. I came for something else. There was a photograph of my mother, taken before the war. She never smiled in photos, but in that one she did. I remember it from childhood. And it had been removed from its frame, Miss Marple said gently. By Mrs. Pargeter, I believe, on the night of the break-in. Not out of malice, but to remove the past that stood in her way. I only wanted it back, Lucinda said, her voice steady now. Not the house, not the money, just something to prove he had remembered her, that he had kept her close. Miss Marple nodded. And perhaps, in the end, that's what he truly left behind. Not a fortune, but a place for peace to begin. No one spoke for some time. At last, Miss Marple reached for her tea. There are things people take for themselves, she said, almost to herself, and things they take because they feel forgotten. She sipped quietly. And it's always the latter that does the greater harm. The air was damp with the soft green hush that comes after early morning rain, and Miss Marple was at her roses. She wore her old straw hat and thick gloves, and moved with the measured certainty of one who has long since learned the rhythm of a garden's demands. The secateurs clicked rhythmically as she clipped away a curling brown leaf, then another. Cherry had arrived just after 10 with her usual cheerful bustle and a small tray of tea things. Now she sat on the little wooden bench near the sweet peas, her voice lowered instinctively to suit the stillness. They found the blue hat, Miss Marple, she said, pouring. Dredged it up only this morning, bottom of the mill pond, just as you said it might be. Feather ruined, of course. Miss Marple nodded, not triumphantly, but with quiet inevitability. Pride is a very heavy thing, she murmured, especially when soaked through with shame. Cherry looked at her, puzzled but not surprised. Lucinda's gone back to Yorkshire, said she'll send a note. Very kind, I thought, the way she said goodbye to everyone. Miss Marple clipped another rose, placed it in the basket by her side, and said nothing. But there was something in the softness of her expression that suggested a chapter had closed, not with finality, but with grace. Cherry stirred her tea thoughtfully. I suppose we'll never know why she threw it in, she said. The hat, I mean. Miss Marple looked out across the garden, where a bee hovered lazily near the lavender. Oh, I dare say we do, she said gently. It was never meant to be kept. It had done its part, suggested a presence that never truly entered the room, allowed someone to slip away unnoticed. It's strange, Cherry said after a pause, how one thing, something as silly as a hat, can hold so much. Wait, Miss Marple supplied, her voice distant. Yes, people often think such objects are merely decoration, but they're quite the opposite. They carry memory, conceal intention, and sometimes, very rarely, they accuse. The silence that followed was not uncomfortable. The garden hummed faintly with insect life and the distant murmur of a lawn-mower somewhere down the lane. Miss Marple reached for a fresh bloom, her hand light, almost reverent. It's a curious thing, Cherry. When someone wants to disappear from blame, they rarely consider what they leave behind. But ponds do not keep secrets nearly as well as people think. Cherry watched the older woman in silence for a moment, then said softly, Lucinda seemed better. Different, somehow. Lighter. Yes, Miss Marple replied, not looking up. That sort of peace only comes when one has retrieved something of the past, not for others, but for oneself. She never wanted the money, did she? No, Miss Marple said. Only the letter. Something written long ago but never sent. It meant more than any legacy. There was a long pause. The breeze moved the hollyhocks gently. And now she's gone, Cherry added, quietly, no fuss. As some of the best people do, Miss Marple said. She returned to her roses, trimming a faded bloom, careful not to disturb the young bud growing beside it. "You know," she said after a moment, "I once found a pressed flower inside a very old book in the church library, long forgotten, and yet it spoke more of love and memory than any words on the page." Cherry tilted her head. "Things left behind?" "Indeed," Miss Marple murmured. "People think forgetting is an act, but sometimes what they leave behind says everything they could never bring themselves to say aloud." A robin landed on the garden wall. "And so," Miss Marple added, eyes soft beneath the brim of her hat, "the world goes on, with its secrets buried in ponds and its truths folded in letters never sent. But eventually, they do find their way." She brushed a petal from her sleeve, her gaze resting not on the flowers, but on the quiet space in between, where things once lost are sometimes remembered. "Thank you for joining me in this quiet unravelling of secrets and silences, nestled among the hedgerows and hearths of St. Mary Mead. In the end, it wasn't a dramatic gesture or a cunning plot that uncovered the truth. It was a forgotten hat, a faded letter, and a woman who listened more than she spoke. Miss Marple, as always, reminded us that the smallest details, those things others overlook, often carry the deepest truths. Beneath the calm surface of village life, we glimpsed wounded pride, long-held hopes, and the quiet ache of unspoken love. The fifth hat was never just fabric and feather. It was a symbol of something left unsaid, a parting never meant to happen. And Lucinda, who returned not for riches, but for a scrap of her mother's heart, reminds us how the past still murmurs in the present, if one listens closely enough. Now I ask you, if you had found that fifth hat in the cloakroom, what might you have thought? Would you have sensed something was amiss, or passed it by, like so many did? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. What do you make of Mrs. Pargeter's actions, and do you think justice was truly served? I read every comment with care and would love to hear your theories. If you enjoyed this gentle mystery and the soft unraveling of human hearts, please do subscribe to the channel. Share this story with a friend who loves classic whodunits and quiet revelations. Together, we'll continue to uncover what lies beneath the surface of ordinary lives, one clue at a time.